Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine history and more specifically Eastern Mediterranean trade in the Justinian era, the 6th century in general. We're coming back to our lottery now. We are alternating the specials with the lottery to content everything and everyone in an auspicious of hierarchy of precedence and harmonious cyclicity. So we sum the Apollonian in the Dionysian for that matter. But jokes aside, in the past months I received lots of views from those videos about the overstatement, say the popular perception of Byzantine civilization over the Latin Germanic one. Many people interpret this as if I didn't care about the Byzantine Empire, was claiming. This is always what you do. You say something in relative terms, and people understand it in absolute terms. I've never disliked the Byzantine Empire. I always sought to study as much as possible at university with the facultative classes, etc., about Byzantine history. And I really like it in general, like so much so that I made hundreds of videos. And of course, on Schwerpunkt, especially as far as medieval history is concerned, and if anything, by distribution, by frequency, because I started, we'll see this relatively soon, like how we're going to talk a bit more about modern contemporary history in manualistic terms as well. Every aspect of politics, of warfare, but also of society. And so, given that the theme of those overstatement videos was also socio-economical, let's give a look to a period that we also really already made lots of videos on. There is an entire playlist dedicated to the Justinian era that is a bit of a universal time in and of itself. So, Eastern Mediterranean during the 6th century. Byzantine Empire, so as the direct continuation of the eastern half of the Roman Empire after the fall of the western half, but not the fall of the empire in that sense, not even in the West, in 476. I hope I don't need even just to explain what I just stated. And obviously, when you look at the concentration of the unitary, essentially eastern part of the empire, you realize that, politically speaking, this was the largest thing. Thus remaining by far the most significant source of financial backing for maritime commerce, right? For a number of reasons. Today we will actually discuss part of the West too, especially lands that had been formerly part of the western half of the empire, such as Africa. And so we're obviously, now we will see chronologically, we will go a bit back and forth, but as the Justinian reconquest was carried out, of course, countries like Italy, Africa, southern Spain, and there you can sort of blur the line depending on what you really want to indicate. Massilia, for example, was de facto behaving as if it was within the empire. We shall make more videos describing that from a political and territorial point of view. Like, that is, what does it mean to be part of the Roman Empire? Has the Roman Empire simply ended in the West even after the dissolution of the western half as a merely administrative part? As a matter of fact, obviously not, right? And in fact, late antiquity was still fairly alive during this period. Just the other day, I made a video about the Lombard invasion of the Italian peninsula, for that matter. So that we know, we're very well acquainted in general, given the sheer size of a number of videos on this very interesting and quite evergreen, in fact, time and place to make further videos on. The eastern half of the empire, as we were also discussing in the aforementioned videos, is generally speaking considered for the 6th century to have been the richest per capita in wealth, compared at least to the whole of the former western half. Right. This is true if you specifically focus on the coastal areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. Regarding the hinterland, there would be actually much to say. And in fact, as we've seen in those videos, the estimate is skewed, especially in terms of absolute wealth, telling the truth, which is in fact not relative wealth, in favor of the fact that you can't even technically say where the Roman Empire sort of ended, even in the East. That's a very interesting aspect of the story. But as we know from Hellenic Hellenistic times and throughout also the whole Roman period, the coastland and the hinterland were two very different things. In the east, there were also many different sort of cultures, nations, countries. The west actually maintained in some areas the highest per capita wealth. This is especially true for Italy. When you look at size also, like Gaul, Italy, etc., like these are just alone, so you don't have to account for all the lands that had been formerly part of the West that were in part now under the Byzantines, and so that's where they also contributed in that qualitative level as the actual targets that the Justinian reconquest sought to successfully reconquer, actually competitive with the eastern half as a whole. And so in that video we have dismantled a little bit this notion that according to some people that are inexplicably sure about this, I can tell you again as a PhD in medieval history that it's a very bold thing to be when you touch on this topic, that when especially you get into the factors, the quantities, etc., socioeconomically speaking, for the 6th century is a bit like notoriously something very blurred, right? And where there are a few centuries. The two halves, if you were still to reason, like were essentially comparable, and we shouldn't be sort of too much, oh my god, that place was so much more advanced. This is not true. We have seen how actually the largest cities at this point in the empire were concentrated in the west, admittedly, in Italy, and at this point, in fact, under the Byzantines, at least after the Gothic War. And that also, again, our general understanding of urbanization, interconnection, per capita wealth, for the indicators that we have is at least, right, sort of comparable between the two sides. We're not going to simply discuss this, but naturally is a topic that you really like. If I told you, like, we're going to discuss now Byzantine earthwares from the 6th century, you wouldn't like the thing. And in fact, I expanded it a little bit because otherwise you don't even get why we would be talking about such a thing. I'm not a socioeconomics sort of expert, whatever, but again, that's more often than not an advantage also to read what essentially also archaeologists, not really historians, find out regarding these things. There is no doubt that in the East, the old Hellenic and now Byzantine formula of, as we were saying, coastal-urban connection was quite effective. There was a thick interconnection of the Eastern Mediterranean, as we'll see now in terms of production support. Think about Constantinople getting grain from Egypt. This is, in fact, the core aspect that also archaeologists follow as a trail when they have to a certain sort of trade production dimensions, because of the Annona system, right? The state-organized supply of subsidized grain, primarily from Egypt, because that was truly the granary of Constantinople, of the eastern half, as Africa had been instead the province of Africa for Italy back in the day, to feed the populations of major cities like, in fact, not just the same Constantinople, but sort of the ones that still kind of existed were actually starting to decline already, together with the entirety of Eurasia. This is not just the Byzantine Empire forever declining or a narrative like that, but still, and this is important. This Annona mechanism structured the regular transport of Egyptian grain to the imperial capital in particular, right? You know that when the Arabs conquer Egypt, that is actually the most, say, unloyal in that gate opening, literally, to Islam, to undermine Byzantine power. Constantinople has to radically shift its grain supplies towards the Black Sea, the Pontic steppe. And so imagine just the dimension of this considering that this was concentrated mostly and increasingly concentrated towards a single big center. Constantinople is already the largest city in the east, right? It is actually in the whole empire. Rome was just a few hectares smaller. In any case, it had been importantly depopulated, especially after the Gothic War. But say that what remains, as we were saying before, is the unitary and therefore absolute amount of resources, regardless of qualitative dimensions, that really impresses you about the eastern half of the empire. Byzantium had been refounded, massively expanded as a veritable infrastructure in and of itself by Constantine I in 330 as the ideally only new Rome, and the permanent seat of Eastern imperial power from that date onward, right? Dominating the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, commanding therefore also the land passages across the between Europe and Asia, maintaining a commanding sort of presence, in fact, mostly on the eastern provinces, and being able, through the cultural, ethnic homogeneity of the essentially Hellenic coastlines, to rebuild during the 5th, the 6th century, a veritably thalassocratic power that was the one that most successful, but not only managed to retake control of the aforementioned lands in the west at the detriment of the Vandals, of the Ostrogoths. We made also videos about this sort of strictly military side of the story. So there's a very big picture overall that is really the awe-inspiring sort of idea that we have of Constantinople, really, in a correct historical sense. And all this, in fact, drawing resources, starting already from this autocratic foundation. I mean, the Byzantine culture had always been much more sort of Hellenistically, even Orientally influenced. It had a much more authoritarian vibe. Constantine himself had abandoned, not really, but say shifted center of power as a new court at the time to Constantinople, exactly to escape the Roman-Italic senatorial power. Was very much still latifundia sort of / feudal based and quite sort of reactive to autocratic impositions compared to the Eastern vibes. We will make more videos about this because one never really points out what was happening also on the other side, or why when Constantinople, for example, was founded properly from Byzantium. And you already can see, especially at the time of Justinian, I made some videos explaining exactly this social-cultural side. There is a shrinking, right? There is the great exhaustion of resources after the Reconquest. It was something really enormous. That facilitated the spread of the great pandemic that will demographically shrink, again, the entire world at that point, as well as raging elsewhere. It's a relatively dark era, right? Aside from the magnificence, again, of Constantinople and much of the eastern centers and of this broader Hellenistic civilization, there's not just a stagnation that this world had been habituated to in late antiquity, but a further shrinking also in material culture, and due not just to the sort of the time. You can't really districate like the words, I don't know, climatological, environmental factor. We don't reason like this anymore. There was a time in which this was very fashionable. I personally never bought that. It should be read mostly in a deeply political sense. Justinian closing the school of philosophy of Athens, imposing ever more sort of restrictive laws on the Jews, the sort of political power being ever more concentrated in the hands of few. You can see this in art, from probably even the idea of culture itself. When we look at Byzantine civilization, aside from the fact that, I don't know, the Italians keep making much better Byzantine art than the one you see in the East, but the idea, for example, that the book, it's in and of itself, the late antiquity, especially in the West, and people seem to have a very sort of sound cognitive dissonance in this regard, was actually open and read, right? People read more books, especially in public readings and so on, in libraries in the West, like whereas in the East, the great libraries were effectively closed. Only a few courtiers normally entered there, so they were mostly like just enormous warehouses, more than accessible living places. So one has to understand probably the radical divide that had always existed between the Western and the Eastern Mediterranean, especially between the Latin, at this point also Latin Germanic, in fact, gradually absorbing that actually sort of proper spring of Romanity in ethnocultural terms, compared to the Hellenic, actually Hellenistic and Oriental at the same time. That is Syrian, Palestinian, Egyptian, etc., sort of mentality is radically different and is conflated historically also by some sort of the way the Roman Empire has been hyper liberally pumped in the last moment of peak, and in fact extremization of that multiculturalistic interpretation of history that people still, even on the right, even in conservative circles, somehow still sort of vote in a very historically incorrect way that has always been known, telling the truth. So these are big topics and should always be maintained. And so back to the Annona, that is a powerful indicator of how much also the general state system worked. You know, that in the West, more or less, when we look at the evaporation of Roman administration, at least in a statal, politically unitary sense, not just much continued, but also from the beginning, what you see is that the increasing correspondence in nature of the Annona as opposed to it had always been a mixed system, telling the truth, also in the early empire. And the finally sort of engulfing kind of mechanism that simply substituted it without much trauma at all, because it was already happening, that you see in fact the true proto-feudal period in Latin Germanic history is the way that tells us, look, before there was a state, and now there quite isn't, at least in the way we intended it by late antique standards, right? There are also relatively different from the ones of the early empire, for that matter, that were actually less centralistic, less bureaucratic, and so on. So the Annona bound, we look mostly at these now. We'll also, again, talk about Africa in particular, but mostly we're looking at the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Annona-bound shippers known as naviculari, these were hereditary ship owners organized into compulsory corporations, guilds, essentially corpora with legal protections and obligations, dating back, at least they had strengthened their power as in an oligarchic sense, in an increasing stratification of society in late antiquity, but the collegia, etc., had always existed, into state service, in fact, with the state. This is typical also the Byzantine War, basically co-opts this increasingly oligarchic privatistic mechanisms with what has remained of this enormous capacity of at least resources concentration. So we speak of, look, the system was actually centralized as a big word, because you have really to wait for the nation state in the 19th century to have an actual centralization. It depends what you really want to mean. It's like, you know, there are ancient steel by modern engineering standards, it's not even steel chemically speaking, but the point here being that when we look at the Byzantine Empire, we say things like, but the pronoia was really not really the feudal system in the West. It was actually more efficient. Was it? Right now, aren't we actually looking at sort of simply a different model, and doesn't really tell us the actual force that existed within it or how much could be successfully leveraged through that, whatever. At this point, admittedly, like in Justinian era, we're not even looking at that, but you can already see in this moment of crisis, of contraction, that listed will soon come in the following generations, how, let's say, truly, again, privatistic and oligarchic the entire system really was, statally speaking. And yet the tie, with as far as the Annona, also for this reason, was never so absolute. For example, as to exclude simultaneous pursuit of private profit. It was impossible even actually just to control entire provinces. This is what basically will push Constantinople to espouse certain weird theological borderline or even openly heretical positions just to try to maintain control on de facto foreign lands in ethnocultural terms, like, again, Egypt, Palestine, etc., in the later period, again, until the Arabs basically took over. All right, also with the support of those people. Now, compensation for supplying the state at a loss took the form of a carefully calibrated series of fiscal advantages, hence the subcontracting also here of once public mechanism. It had always been in the hands of privates, but at least in a more sort of straightforward and efficient mechanism. Some privileges granted broad and highly desirable exemptions from ordinary civic burdens themselves, This is also a great indicator of actual subtle destructuration. You know that, again, everybody complains about the late antiquity, the old, say the highest declarationists that were started basically bailing out of their civic duties. Cities were targeted by barbarian invasion, etc. There is this basically withdrawal to the countryside with fortification of the villas that turned into the cortes and so on. And what you see here, albeit at least depending on some parts of the West, in this some parts of the East, showing still a civic, or at least a public statal mechanism working, you realize that the only way actually to maintain control was, again, privatizing, right? And so basically from Constantinople, they were saying, okay, I will, give you these liberties. I will not ask you anymore to basically maintain local government as soon as you actually ship us grain, which, as you understand, is actually a form of indebtment, because these places will increasingly become more autonomous. So in the shorter, medium run, yes, that's maybe the exact way these powers normally thought, because there wasn't much to predict, unfortunately, in this era, just like not much even in our own days in different terms. But they especially needed income. They needed resources, and especially the army, the Byzantine army, the Byzantine navy required this massive grain supplies, all right, for maintaining a quite respectable army that we have seen, of course, mostly actually being sustained by the local provinces wherever they were dislocated. I made a video about Byzantine army organization here between 500, 650. That is also the great sort of regimental system that will survive even in part of the Islamic world, etc. In the West, it was basically analogous, except it had an increased certification and elite dominance in much more close-knit societies in a national sense on their own. So we tend to say, okay, well, that is something different. But yet in practice, they had the same power available in sort of interest of regional capacities. These exemptions were notably, for example, the land tax, right? So this was known as the Annona civica or capitatio iugatio. We know this very well from essentially Diocletian's reforms, right? Go check that video out. I have a video about Byzantine society in general, so you can find all the various also perspective, if you're interested just in the eastern part of the empire, whatever. So this was a combined poll and land tax that often proved crushing for landowners, that worked also in very interesting ways when you look, for example, frontier provinces actually owing more in proportion, which is counterintuitive because they were actually less developed, but they were under greater threat. So the logic was they had to field mostly more people. So it was mostly providing labor force, aka agricultural resources, and manpower in terms of levy militias, right? Now we are simplifying also in terms of, we are here just talking about how more or less the system worked. The sort of Byzantine Empire is enormous. Again, it has truly an ecumenic scope here, so different places work slightly in different ways. There was also the elimination of the compulsory service on town councils, the so curiales, which in practice relieved the most economically active ship owners from the ruinous liturgies that crippled many other property classes, right? And this was actually some anti-traditional way, because landowners were actually left in charge of local administration. At the same time, these had now less resources coming from the third estate that was the one instead supporting Constantinople, which is also a general mechanism. Monarchies tend to associate with the lower estates against the nobility. And so you see there how dangerous this actually is. That's also why the navy is so important for the Byzantines, because they can just very stretch comparison, but just like the British Empire, just to reach those coastland areas. You understand how tight really the Byzantine Empire was to coastal areas, and reduce them to obedience without even caring about what the hell was happening in the hinterland, right? This happened in many instances. Think about the Africa of the Circoncellones during the Donatistic heresy/uprising. Like you wonder how the Byzantine Empire actually the structure itself. You don't really find these mechanisms in the West. In the West, the Germans settled, they preserve what the Romans have attained, and the system basically preserves its fundamentals. It doesn't matter how shrank or rigged by war that they had been. Now, the Capitatio Iugatio in particular combined a poll tax, again, on persons with a land tax assessed on fiscal units, hence Iuga and Capita, creating a cumulative burden that could drive even moderately prosperous landowners into insolvency when repeated demands for extraordinary levies or corvée labor were added, which was also the norm in times of emergency. Think about even, the wars that the empire had to fight. The expansion in the West, eventually the return of the Persian threat, etc. Exemption from both, therefore, represented a major competitive edge for those fortunate enough to hold navicularius status, at least. I would like to stress, by the way, that the Islamic, quote-unquote Islamic army that besieged Constantinople in 711 was largely manned at sea by this actually Christian, Egyptian, Palestinian, Syrian mariners' crews, etc. All right, and so when you look at the naviculari, you say, well, basically, this is what you get for giving them more autonomy. The third estate must be kept under check. And there you see all the contradictions, but if you actually see it from the Constantinopolitan side, it was also in part uncontrollable, and or in the moment they were nobody saw the Islamic invasion at this point coming. Just how randomly things can go. But obviously, Muslim expansion there was also the consequence of a terrible sort of administrative policy in the Levant by the Byzantines that could barely even control the thing to begin with. Other concessions conferred more direct commercial benefits. The state assumed a substantial share of the cost of constructing and outfitting vessels. This was very important, again, for the fleet. So they were just investing in a strategic asset, per se, but still obviously needing to count on this third estate or these maritime communities, right? The only ones that had the shipyards, that had sort of the technical know-how, skill, etc., to have it just to provide this kind of ships, often covering the provision, in fact, of timber, cordage, sails, and even skilled labor from imperial arsenals or requisitioned provincial craftsmen, while the risk of total or partial loss at sea, whether from storm, piracy, or enemy action, was transferred in large measure to the imperial fisc, and so also to the general subjects through mechanisms that allowed claims to be lodged against provincial treasuries or the sacre largitiones, so that the central imperial treasury handling revenues, expenditures, and state finances. Right? This is very important because, again, the subjects that paid for this were mostly also the peasants working in the latifundia of the great lords. Right? And it was understood, again, that this investment was necessary anyway. You need a functional military. And for the characteristics of the empire in question, as we just stated, especially a very strong navy at this point. Now, this risk transfer created well-documented opportunities for fraud, as captains and owners could claim losses that had been exaggerated or even staged, for example, by deliberately scuttling unseaworthy hulls or colluding with coastal communities to, quote-unquote, recover only a fraction of a declared cargo, yet the arrangement nonetheless lowered the effective resources thresholds required to operate large tonnage vessels and encouraged the entry into the trade of entrepreneurs who might otherwise have been deterred by prohibitive costs and uncertainties of long-distance shipping. Now, this mechanism, by the way, is very similar to the one that existed historically in other sort of moments of medieval commercial expansion. For example, the Italian maritime republics work in very similar ways. The point is that they were city-states. Everything that happened was managed from the mother city. When you are instead here from Constantinople dictating rule over everyone, and you're basically hoping that these mechanisms will not essentially simply shipwreck into corruption, because you can't quite even check how a ship was eventually lost, or whether the local administrators were bribed or whatever. The thing keeps actually eroding the system a little bit. It was important, again, to keep this trade alive for obvious reasons, but at the same time, it was an imperfectly functioning system in ways that are a bit more substantial than what you would have sort of liked. Most importantly, provided the Naviculari discharged their Annona obligations in full on schedule, by the way, they also retained the right, subject only to defined restrictions, to conduct independent business on their return voyages, free from the patchwork of custom dues, the portoria, the telonea, the vectigali, and transit tolls that ordinarily fell upon private merchants at every provincial boundary and major harbor. These tolls, by the way, were not that light. They could accumulate to 5 to 10% or more of cargo value at successive collection points along major trunk routes, and their cumulative weight often made marginal voyages unprofitable. Right, so then you start feeling the weight of the period in general. Exemption, therefore, constituted a decisive subsidy. But again, they kept funding, with sort of still at the cost of the system. When the massed Egyptian Annona fleet was under sail, and these were important events, even strategically. You had to be extremely careful about, some of this fleet could be destroyed, could be poisoned. The weather was always like a lottery. And in this sense, they were so effectively organized. There was so much invested in them that the Mediterranean could appear, in the hyperbolic language of contemporaries, like dry land, right, covered by an unbroken carpet of canvas and hulls, hundreds of vessels moving in convoy under military escort, obviously, their combined tonnage dwarfing any purely commercial armada of the period, right? This tells you what kind of pull Constantinople alone had, right, over also these provinces. It was a massive military expedition, obviously considered the same navies of this era were not to interdict any stretches of sea or whatever, but just to escort themselves the cargoes, like the supplies that were in case of sort of military theater to, in fact, feed the armies on land, mostly marching along the same coast. And so at that point, you could be intercepted if you didn't have warships. The enemy could take out your entire resources. It could have an army starving to death, even in some specific, or dissolving at that point in some parts of the well-developed Mediterranean. Now, because the outbound journey had already been financed and insured by the state, by the way, the return leg became in effect a heavily subsidized commercial enterprise in which overheads were dramatically reduced and risk exposure minimized. Right, it was more complicated for this thing to just sink, for example, to be attacked or whatever. The state-covered outbound passage effectively turned what would otherwise have been a high-risk ballast run into a profitable opportunity, allowing shippers to undercut competitors who had to bear the full cost of both legs. All right. This, again, tells you how artificial it is, but also how much needed. Right, and how the system holds for a while when there are resources, but later becomes more stretched. One of the most archaeologically visible return cargoes in this period was the distinctive variant of red slipware manufactured at Phocaia. Yes, the ancient Hellenic polis in western Anatolia, renowned in late antiquity for its pottery kilns and strategic position near the approaches to Constantinople, and therefore in the immediate hinterland of the imperial capital, as a matter of fact. The workshops of Phocaia, we can say Phocaia as a matter of fact, produced a fine, hard-fired tableware with a characteristic bright red-orange slip and relatively thin walls forms that achieved wide circulation around the Eastern Mediterranean basin, and to a lesser but still measurable degree penetrated Western markets as far as southern Gaul, eastern Spain, and parts of Italy. Right, and that's where again archaeology is our tracer, because even though there was surely an imitation in other places, this was mostly the marker of Constantinople via Phocea. Phocaean vessels, typically open forms such as bowls, dishes, plates with simple inverted rims and low ring fit, exhibit a consistent fabric of well-levigated clay with sparse calcareous inclusions and occasional mica flecks fired to a uniform bright orange-red color that distinguishes them from coarser regional imitations as well, also known as late Roman sea ware in archaeological typologies. Distribution maps show particularly dense concentrations, predictably, where, according to along the western Anatolian coast, the Aegean Islands, also obviously the Propontis, the Black Sea approaches, with thinner but consistent scatters reaching Cyprus, the Levant, and the Nile Delta. So those aforementioned shippers, like coming back from Constantinople, would bring this stuff. Obviously, there was a broader circulation where also ships, as we'll see now, that still were into this kind of autonomous ventures across this theaters. Smaller quantities appear in 6th century contexts at sites in southern Italy, but also further north, especially around Ravenna and Classe for obvious reasons. This was, again, the capital of the Exarchate, the major Adriatic port, and the major Italian port for the east. The principal late antique port of Ravenna with this major Byzantine naval base itself. So, that's kind of obvious. The rest, part of the Adriatic, and even as far west as Marseille, the ancient Massalia, founded by Phocaean colonists in the 6th century BC. And this is quite fascinating because the city was not, as we said before, an important commercial node at this point in history. That still leave like minted coins with properly impaired. This was done also in Romano-Germanic kingdoms, but was sort of living as if it had always remained there, has it always been connected with that Hellenic coastal dimension. This is the major divide of any kind of Hellenic approach to regional spaces, right? And it's not wrong to say that Massalia was still very connected after a millennium of history with the mother city in Anatolia. That's the most extraordinary part. Tarragona, as well in the west, the Roman Tarraco, whose late antique harbor continued to receive eastern imports. This was historically a very big, the most important city in the northeast. We've seen it also in our recent videos about the Roman conquest of Hispania back in the day. Now, the restoration of direct imperial control over the former Vandal kingdom in Africa following the campaigns of 533-534, I recently made a video about Vandalic warfare, by the way, if you're interested, almost certainly contributed to a parallel resurgence in the eastward flow of African red slip ware. In archaeological typologies abbreviated as ARS, the dominant fine tableware produced in northern Tunisia from the 1st to the 7th centuries, characterized by its glossy red slip and stamp roulette decorations. Naturally, northern Tunisia was one of the most traumatically overtly Romanized provinces in the entire Roman Empire. Right, so this is not a surprise, since the early Italic settlement after the Punic Wars and the sort of extraordinary urban development that occurred there that eventually would fade. Like with Ifriqiya, however, also in the Islamic era, representing an important regional cradle, let's say, with some also agricultural hinterland. It was historically the reason why I think about all the old Carthaginian latifundia, for that matter, very much connected with Sicily, obviously. And those production centers in this northern Tunisian coastline, especially around the same Carthage, in fact, the ancient Punic and Roman metropolis, reestablished as a Byzantine provincial capital, as we've seen in those videos about Vandalic campaigns after its recapture by Belisarius in 533. There is also further west the Biza-Sena hinterland that had previously also been part of the Vandalic rule, even though it had suffered disruption more in the western frontier historically during the same Vandalic conquest. There was also an important Berber pressure, as the Byzantines had to go back there every once in a while. I will not digress, by the way, on the cost-benefits ratio of the Byzantine reconquest. In my opinion, they did really well. This is the opinion I've always formed about that. It's just that they couldn't necessarily think that things would evolve in later generations the way they would, and trying to presume that the contingent strategies had to be dictated by this is insane, right? As I said before, they could barely predict whether they could win major wars that they had invested so much in. So the provincial backwater like Africa did turn out to be expensive at some point for military defense, but not overwhelmingly during the bigger picture. Now, African red, say African wares, make it simple, workshops concentrated in the area between Carthage and Leptis Magna, further east, as down the coast, the major Tripolitanian city in Libya today, whose harbor and pottery kilns remain active, in fact, into the Byzantine period, resumed large-scale output of classic forms after the Reconquest, right? You have, there is Hayes, for example, that is a study, if you're interested in this scholarship, says, Schwerpunkt does not list a bibliography, whatever. There is all an emerging deware repertoire. I presume also archaeology has moved on in the last years now. I admittedly haven't sort of seen the latest updates, but the bigger picture hasn't been altered, obviously. You have this characteristic glossy red slip, fine leviation, and as we said before, stamp or roulette decoration that had made the ware a Mediterranean staple in the 4th and early 5th centuries back in the day, before, again, the Vandals had come by. There wasn't surely even this radical fracture with production, but let's say that the Byzantines had some more infrastructural interconnections. The Vandals had been very aggressive, piratically speaking, in the central and western Mediterranean. They had refused compromise with both the Byzantines and the Goths that they had sort of battled with over the control of Sicily. Both Phocaean red slip and the African, this Tunisian Tripolitanian one, typically traveled as secondary cargoes, stowed in the spaces between primarily bulk goods such as grain, oil, or wine, frequently packed in straw or reed matting to prevent abrasion, and their distribution therefore functions as a sensitive tracer of underlying currents of exchange rather than as evidence of dedicated fine ware commerce. And this tells you, yes, that in that provincial dimension, surely North Africa was more depauperated than, of course, the core lands near to Constantinople, right? By the way, as we'll perhaps see better later, ceramic evidence is not sort of the game changer in our political, social, or military understanding of the picture, all right? Say North Africa will always remain somehow secondary also in the later Islamic period. Yes, you have a great connection between Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt historically. Think about the Fatimids, think about sort of how that area was somehow enucleated as one on its own, autonomously enough. But it could not compete with Eastern Mediterranean trade or quality production also in some of the core lands of the Byzantine Empire, especially after the war that had been, again, heavy. It's also this local instability, Berber incursions, etc. You see, archaeologists don't really hear that much about this. They tell, okay, historians step in because, that's your thing. They're not even interested in telling the truth. Now, ceramic evidence, however, makes it clear that the impact of state-directed interests on distribution patterns was far from uniform or mechanically predictable for the entire picture. Like in the Western Mediterranean, the Annona nexus appears to have actively encouraged the continued export of goods from the principal Annona supplying region, Africa Proconsularis and Byzantina, long after the political collapse of the West. Right. This is interesting also because this land is reconquered. Again, it was pretty developed historically. Quantities for the African ware forms, especially the Hayes types 91 with its flanged rim, the 93 with concave base, and 99 with stamped motifs, and later D-ware series with simpler, thicker profiles remain prominent in 6th century contexts from Rome. For example, notably the Crypta Balbi and forum excavations provide us with this evidence. To southern Gaul, Marseille, Arles, and the Rhone corridor, and the Balearics, that had been part of the Vandalic kingdom, in fact, where African wares often constitute from, say, 1/5 to a half or more even of fine ware assemblages, even after the mid-6th century, which is the moment of the greater crisis with the pandemic and everything. This is also quite fascinating. Again, basing yourself on some socio-economical patterns simply on the basis of this words is not that thing. Like, again, there were some parts of Europe that were already more inward-oriented or locally self-sustaining. They did not engage in the Annona anymore, so it's also a matter of political alignment, right? Also, the same ware types change over time. Again, there is a general worsening in the latter part of the 6th century for everybody involved. However, in the Eastern Mediterranean, interestingly enough, by contrast, there is no comparable overseas dissemination, for example, of Egyptian amphorae, notably late Roman 7 carat-shaped wine containers from the Mareotis and Abu Mena regions, or Egyptian fine wares on anything like the same scale. Nor do significant volumes of Phocaean red slip appear in Egyptian assemblages as one might anticipate if traffic between Alexandria, so obviously the great Hellenistic foundation and principal port of Egypt, whose grain, as the fleet, as we've seen, supplied the same Annona, and Constantinople had been strictly reciprocal in character. This is incredibly fascinating, right? And it could be an indicator of Western autonomous quality in the sense that Constantinople, as we've seen, dominated in a broader political, logistical sense the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So they didn't even necessarily need much of their ware. And paradoxically, the more autonomous Western regions were capable, instead of shifting east, their own products, right? And this also could mean naturally that in Egypt, again, those Levantine regions were not poor, right? Generally speaking, they were fairly developed themselves, and very developed, especially in the coastal areas, as we pointed out before. But it's as if they had been more suppressed and less autonomous, less entrepreneurial. In part, the mechanism that we just described before about the state sponsor of those massive expeditions may have brought to an over-reliance over that mechanism and stiffened possible local autonomies, as a matter of fact, right? Because as we've seen, yes, there were exemptions for the third estate, but not much for autonomous trade, rather to participate to this anonymous shippings that were, again, enormous and were therefore very much state control. This, I think, is also, in terms of mental frames, describing these people is quite interesting, because it shows you that there is a much greater subjection and suppression in, say, in fact, Byzantine autocracy in the East that makes the system going, other than some more spontaneous activity. I think this is incredibly important as a hint. Now, local Egyptian red-slipped wares, the so-called Egyptian red slip A with its Micasius fabric, and B with finer paste and more standardized forms, and Cypriot red slip forms with their distinctive orange buff fabric and banded rouletting overwhelmingly dominate Egyptian sites throughout the 6th century. From Alexandria and Marian to the north to the Thebaid and Fayum oases in the south, suggesting that inter-regional production satisfied most demand and that long-distance fine ware exchange played a secondary role. So also these Levantine, at least here for Egypt, that was the most important of these provinces, as we've seen, had some internal market. It had provincialized, did not really have this again, capacity to simply export, right? And again, it was not a poor place in general, but it was somehow cutting off from the general Byzantine game itself. Whereas, for example, as we've seen, Africa in the West remained a bit more vivacious. The flows of shipping generated around, there are reasons for this, by the way, as well, namely the fact that Egypt has a massive interland as well, right? It's true that it's actually not much populated down the sort of upriver. Africa has a very distinct sort of, Tunisia has the aforementioned agricultural interland, but it's also mostly and obviously projected towards the northern shores of the Mediterranean. This is not necessarily the case for Egypt in general. And if you look at, for example, the African ware you find in Italy as well, Italy was also doing fine. So the idea that sort of these imports necessarily, as I said before, like in a manufacturing sense, it's just because, whomever was more passive. No, you can't tell. You should look at the world market and understand what was imported, exported. And actually, the reason why we're looking at wares is that we're the main containers for specific products, but they don't tell us the entire picture economically speaking. It's just overall sort of an important aspect. And so always consider, again, local production, local markets as well. Why we find these traces and others, it's not that easy to simply answer. There's complex systems we'll never fully know, never be fully able to reconstruct. Now, the flows of shipping generated around Constantinople and probably around other major consumption centers such as Antioch, another big center, the principal city of Syria, city of the Comes Orientis, also with an important strategic command and a major entrepot for Levantine goods, and Alexandria undeniably structured the interregional theater of the Eastern Mediterranean economy. Yet, the precise balance between state-organized and commercially driven shipping within these networks remain extraordinarily difficult to assess. In fact, again, we find wares, yes, but often associated with the same Annona. Why is the Annona so important? Because obviously, from an archaeological point of view, wherever it passed, it tended to leave more traces of it, right? Quantitatively speaking, just and incidentally, not also. Underwater archaeology is extremely expensive. Nobody really does it. So again, as I said in those videos about the overstatement of Byzantine civilization or whatever, the mathematical assessment of these values, it's extremely tenuous, right? It's mostly an impression rather than an assessment even. And it's obvious that the smaller trade is sort of overall difficult to reconstruct, even if you find single ships here and there. Like, what the hell do you know about how it really was at the time? There isn't much of a clear understanding. We can obviously put together all possible elements and formulate theories, right? But in general, we know very few about the wall. Besides Constantinople itself, textual and archaeological indications for state supply systems are also, and in fact, limited. At Alexandria and Antioch, no equivalent to the detailed Notitia Dignitatum entries for the Annona Civica of the capital survives for either city, for example. And the papyrological record from Egypt, while notoriously rich in fiscal and agricultural detail in particular, contains only sporadic references to the organization of large-scale grain shipments to the capital after the mid-6th century. All right, you have those beautifully preserved papyri in the dry, semi-arid or even desertic landscape, but also in that case, it's very, say, in relative terms, is very substantial amount of documentary evidence, historical, also for history of the church, etc. But for reconstructing the whole picture, hardly satisfactory. Two fragmentary inscriptions, one from Abydos, that was the strategic late antique harbor and customs station controlling the Hellespont approach to Constantinople, recording fees payable by vessels entering the same strait. The other from Seleucia Pieria, the principal port serving Antioch, that, as you know, is not quite on the sea. In fact, in this case, the port is located at the mouth of the Orontes River itself, detailing charges at the port serving the city, offer rare contemporary textual confirmation of the varied provenances of incoming shipping and the diversity of goods drawn towards these major centers. The Abydos text lists tolls differentiated by vessel type and origin, including references to ships from Egypt, Syria, and the Pontic coast, while the Seleucia fragment enumerates levies on wine, oil, and other commodities without specifying whether the carriers were Annona contractors or independent merchants. Neither inscription, however, distinguishes systematically between state-directed traffic and private commerce either. All right, you should be extremely lucky just to find the right source. That's not how things normally work from a statistical point of view. Now, state interests alone are, in any case, insufficient to explain the full ramification of interregional exchange suggested by archaeological record. So think what we were saying before, that the East was more interconnected, it was understood to be richer. Okay, but we don't even know how much trade occurred where with whom, banally, right? Some things are obviously reconstructible in a vectorial sense if you still find lapis lazuli in the early medieval Western European era. It's obvious that something from Afghanistan would cross the Middle East, the Levant, and arrive to places that are like Italy or France. But and this was always the case. But quantitatively speaking, to give probably a qualitative assessment as well, this is insufficient, right? It's not really clear, right? Coastal regions. I mentioned the lapis lazuli, by the way, because notoriously those were used to properly to color blue in manuscript illuminations that we do find. And so we do know in that case that connection existed with Central Asia, where this normally came from. That we don't even know exactly where they would come from. But again, quantities, numbers, don't be so sure about things in general, right? And especially, this is also good historical advice in general. Never think that there are radical differences, right? When, a system is gigantic and overly developed, another one isn't, right? In a matter of hundreds of years, or just looking at what eventually will remain levels of development of urbanization, because it doesn't make any sense, just even by guts, all right? Coastal regions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean continued to trade foodstuffs in amphora, not only with one another, obviously implying the existence of several interlocking regional systems, but in provincial ones, local ones, but also across to the Western Basin. In certain Western Mediterranean assemblages dated to the 5th and 6th centuries, the rising proportions of Eastern Mediterranean amphora types, such as the late Roman one from Cyprus and southern Anatolia with its globular body and ridged handles, late Roman 3, as we've seen from Western Asia with its carrot-shaped profile, late Roman 4 and 5/6 from the Levant with bag-shaped bodies and distinctive rim forms, can only be explained by commercial exchange rather than state-directed supply. Right, we know that there weren't these massive expeditions after 400 that there wasn't properly, that there was no other knowledge aside from the scattering patterns that also here archaeologically we're not really discussing, because they would present us with further enormous difficulties and complications in evaluation. But in general, we're not told that at the time of Odoacer, of Theodoric, there was such a thing like the Annona paid to Constantinople. And especially in this massive shippings all of the time. it wasn't a thing, right? The systems sustained themselves by themselves. And so the increases most plausibly reflect instead private shippers identifying and exploiting new lucrative markets in a Western economy that had become increasingly starved of long-distance imports, and the political fragmentation of the 5th century and the attendant contraction of African production capacity, which makes sense because we know that, think about Gothic Italy, that the Roman centers were trying to sort of push for that sort of reintegration into the broader imperial markets that, in any case, the Ostrogoths had partly sort of closed or for sustaining their local resources and so on. It was a matter of range, right? It was also a matter of sort of straightforward conquest. I mean, those Roman latifundia owners were habituated just to straddle the Mediterranean. They had estates, massive estates across multiple regions at a time. So it's obvious that, even as we said before, Vandalic piracy, for example, crippling maritime trade, etc., in the West, had sort of starved truly the local markets for that historical greater access into the Mediterranean as a Roman lake. The same logic applies to much of the because late antiquity was alive, and much of the international exchange that characterized the more dynamic Eastern economy of the period. The scope for private enterprise was wide, and the commercial advantages enjoyed by those involved in the Annona, and so with these exemptions from multiple layers of taxation and risk transfer to the fisc, subsidized return capacity provided powerful incentives for shippers to maximize side cargoes whenever possible as well. Any attempt to classify exchange as either purely state or tied, and therefore non-commercial on one side and purely private, so commercial on the other, is therefore too inflexible. In any case, we know that the sort of normal traffic was more important as a whole. It just had a shorter reach, but it was active, it existed, especially at a closer range along the coast. That was sort of obvious there. We've seen also in Africa, right? You have, again, from Tunisia, from even parts of today's Algeria, reaching Egypt. Such a dichotomy neglects the extent to which public obligations and private transactions were structurally interdependent, with state infrastructure, ports, lighthouses, beacon chains, and protected convoy routes and fiscal concessions actively enabling and amplifying commercial activity. The Annona fleet's outward passage created protected sea lanes that private operators could exploit. They would have also followed, for sort of geographical reasons, more or less some same routes. The return voyages subsidies capacity turned ballast runs into revenue opportunities, and the fiscal privileges attached to state service lowered barriers to entry for entrepreneurs who might otherwise have found Mediterranean-scale shipping prohibitively expensive. So the entwining of public and private interests means that the patterns of 6th and 7th, partially at 7th century interregional Mediterranean exchange, resist easy synthesis into a single model after all. Not much changes in this period. There is this generalized decline, shrinking, whatever, but the fundamentals are not particularly altered. A fundamental distinction must nevertheless be drawn between the eastern and western basins, as we said before. Now, in the eastern Mediterranean, all available evidence, ceramic, numismatic, textile, and settlement, points to a widespread late antique boom in the rural economy that remained closely associated with the production of exportable surpluses destined for overseas markets. All right, and in great part this happens because of the stabilization of the eastern half of the empire. That was always a difficult business, up to, in fact, the invasions of the Sasanians later on. So, before the Islamic ones, generally speaking, the system holds as a great hub. It was difficult for whoever in the Middle East just even to sort of threaten to fully conquer, to directly control those regions anyway. Like the Sasanians were annoying, they raided into Syria and everything, but overall, in the West you have a greater destructuring, war instability. Again, the Justinian era witnesses to the conquest of the West, and so there were lots of returns to the East. And so, unsurprisingly, this expansion, that does not mean even, again, it's something we see epiphenomenally, meaning that, again, surplus is scarce for everybody here. Belisarius's soldiers had to use wood, admittedly, yes, in Italy and during times of hard war, but this is exactly the point. That's what you would expect from the West. There were wars of reconquest, there was a general destabilization, differently from the East. And so this expansion in the Eastern market persists through most of the 6th century. It's, again, driven by agricultural output. We can say this in relative terms to the same places because there is an increase. Right, and it's difficult to compare simply different provinces, but we can see also in earlier phases of dramatic investment and demographic growth that had concluded in certain regions that's what normally speaks, of course, of a general level of development. I mean, Byzantine civilization at that point does not require much of an introduction. Everybody knows how advanced they were, how strong, how stable, even stagnating and not sort of collapsing was a big deal, all right? In the West, by contrast, interregional exchange, because that's what we're talking about here, trade routes, had already been declining in volume and structural complexity for several generations and remained heavily dominated by, in the wares, traceability by African goods well into the 6th and the 7th centuries. Remember, again, that Africa remained always the port of Italy, also when it was reconquered, right, by Justinian. So it's obvious that there would be something similar for Italy up to the point like the Vandals had conquered Africa and would cut the supplies. Right, this is something that would happen to Constantinople just, again, when the Arabs conquered Egypt. And so this very spaced away in time. Now, producers in Spain, Gaul, or Italy would regularly marketed surplus production overseas, rarely, if ever, did so by packing their agricultural goods in transport amphorae or by shipping fine ware pottery as a side cargo. The African ceramics in associated amphorae continued to reach distant markets through the 6th century into the 7th, yet even here production shows clear signs of simplification before the end of the 5th century, which lines up well with dissolution of the West in general terms, the sort of regionalization of internal markets as well. That's important. As we've seen, even a developed country like Egypt was not really outwardly projected, but we definitely see also in the West like a simplification of material culture. And there is no doubt that, again, in relative terms, the West was going down for a while the East was going up for a while. Right, does not tell us in absolute terms exactly what the situation was. Again, they were roughly comparable in scale, in the most developed regions, also in quality for that matter. And again, I already discussed this all very well, because as I said at the beginning of the video, people usually don't understand the difference between relative and absolute, right? Which is the way to make any kind of wild assessment without any actual plausibility. It's not even care, just scrupple, just it doesn't hold water. Now, of the 3 main African ceramic categories recognized in standard typologies, only the ware produced in northern Tunisia remained manufactured by around the mid-6th century. And even this ware experienced a marked reduction in the number of circulating forms over the following 100 years. So we said before that this ware is actually to be found in Egypt, and so that was some important autonomy. But it's still very much reduced from the mid-6th century, which is actually the moment in which the Byzantines reconquer Africa. And so, as we said before, you see, you have to be very careful about the distinctions. Yes, we find later this African ware going over to the east, which didn't happen in Vandalic times, but you also find that in Vandalic times, in spite of reduction of production, that there is still such stuff. By the way, the amphorae were used just normally to preserve but they were also used in that sense, in the way we can especially track them archaeologically, to be stored to be stored for inter-regional exchange, right? International exchange. You understand how many complicated factors to take into account. So even the Byzantine reconquest wasn't particularly helpful. I mean, ask the Italians. The heaviest blow that Italy ever got in sort of historical times was exactly the Gothic War, right? And that was not a struggle to save the poor Italians from the terrible Goths. That was actually a Latin Germanic struggle to prevent the Byzantines to reconquer Italy. Aside from those senators, they reasoned in a more international way, and they had sort of their own reasons. The Byzantines sort of screwed up because they could conquer Italy very easily, right? Hadn't they recalled Belisarius, it would have been done practically, but they managed to blip everything up and to have armies going back and forth twice or thrice. And in all this, Italy still remained dramatically urbanized, dramatically developed, and even rich. So that's interesting as well. And you see this African ware being traceable for reasons probably of dependency from the northern shores of the Mediterranean, not much because Africa was particularly better placed than, I don't know, Italy or southern Gaul or southern Spain, you know. African amphora of the period cannot be yet classified or dated with comparable precision. But the cumulative evidence from quantified site assemblages and kiln surveys implies an analogous contraction in variety, scale, and organizational complexity. Field survey data from the Sagarmes Valley, the Kasserine region, in the Libyan pre-desert valleys further indicate that rural settlement density in Africa Proconsularis in Byzacena had already passed its peak before the 6th century. The decline that had begun in the 5th began to accelerate noticeably from perhaps the middle decades of the 6th century onward, coinciding with but not necessarily caused by the Justinianic plague of 541-42. You know how impacting this really was, at least according to description, likely bubonic plague, but there are debates regarding this for that matter. Some think that it was not really the case. That spread across the Mediterranean and caused significant population loss and economic disruption in affected areas and subsequent epidemiological waves. This is just an error. Naturally, archaeology evolves. We have ever more and better data, but still it costs a lot, so it's actually all very slowly and again always insufficient in any case. Survey transects in the Sagarmes region document this gradual reduction in the number, for example, of occupied sites from the 5th century onward. This is not just about where, with many smaller farmsteads abandoned and larger estates showing signs of reduced investment in olive presses and storage facilities. In the Kasserine area, site numbers dropped sharply after around 500, accompanied by a retreat from marginal lands previously brought under cultivation. Consider there is a stagnation and crisis within the same Vandalic kingdom that does not seem to have actually brought about much structural issues to the system in terms of destruction, whatever the Vandals were naturally raiding all around, but they cared about their African hinterland. The Libyan pre-desert valleys exhibit a similar pattern, by the way, with the density of fortified farmsteads, the Zur and associated field systems declining markedly by the mid-6th century, again suggesting a contraction of sedentary agricultural activity in the face of increasing insecurity and perhaps environmental stress. In the eastern Mediterranean, by contrast, and this is just to get to the various areas from where we get the wares rather than studying, like again, Spain, Gaul, Italy, they're very big, documented and sort of more complex and deep systems. In the Eastern Mediterranean, by contrast, patterns of production and overseas exchange remain markedly more diverse and polycentric. This makes sense, again, because the hinterlands are more productive in general than the African one. The late antique settlement boom, closely tied to the capacity to generate exportable agricultural surpluses, was almost certainly sustained throughout the 6th and in many areas into the early 7th centuries. Earlier cycles of dramatic expansion and heavy resources investment may have drawn to a close in some districts, such as the limestone massif of northern Syria, where the construction of villages and churches peaks in the 5th century before leveling off, for example. Yet this should be interpreted as a phase of consolidation and stabilization rather than outright stagnation or retreat. Because, again, toward the 6th century, especially the second half, like surplus pretty much scarce everywhere. So again, paradoxically, the Byzantine Empire was much more stable in many areas that are parts of the world. Comparable zones in the interior of Palestine, for example, continued to exhibit high levels of prosperity with dense village networks, intensified olive and vine cultivation, and continued investment in ecclesiastical and domestic architecture well into the 6th century and beyond. Across the eastern provinces as a whole, there is little indication of any generalized crisis of production or distribution before around 600. Lots of interesting things were going on also with the Persians, etc. So naturally we could go on, but it would become redundant at some point. The whole picture that you get is, again, one of sort of extreme complexity when it comes especially to the methodological aspect, the evidence. But overall, the broader picture makes sense, right? It's part of what we are sort of habituated to know about the times and places. I haven't quite made any other sort of, there's a medieval society, medieval economy, medieval trade even playlist. There is nothing more filtered on the basis of, I can always grade it, of course, on the basis of other era here, say Justinian socioeconomic, no. Nevertheless, I was seeing here that Justinian, this is the 18th video about the Justinian era. It's sort of touching to to me because these are some of the first topics, say not this one in particular, but the Justinian ones that I've, generally speaking, ever touched, like Justinian Reconquest, etc. Some re-uploads, by the way. And yeah, and it feels like 18 is even too few. We have made, naturally, Schwerpunkt has changed a lot over the years. I varied my content in ways that normally aren't that sort of out there as we would normally do now. That at the time seemed, feasible, so to say. But overall, I must say that the general work here is not a bad one. We are doing what we know better, right? Or at least we are, again, consolidating. I would like to actually more, it was a very good idea to come back to the cycle, because you see, a topic like this, who would ever have the chance to discuss online? I mean, seriously. And the fact that I'm the only one doing this is a gold standard, isn't it? I mean, let me just check. I'm sure there is something akin to that Justinian, maybe not the same term, but trade. No. There is for once my own content appearing. There's literally nothing else called Justinian on YouTube. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. You see, for all those Byzantine fanboys that eventually recriminate on my content, on Schwerpunkt because I say things regarding the overstatement of Byzantine civilization over the Western one in particular, which is in and of itself a relative issue. They don't really get, we are the only ones covering these topics. So again, I don't even, we can't but be glad about the wall in general. So I always take the chance of making a video more, even when I say, well, this may be boring, ceramics, pottery, whatever. But then you discover that there's so much in it that you can track, that you can sort of say, well, this is reliable information, right? That you can in turn rely on, and the result is kind of obvious, kind of necessary even, given that we're truly the only ones discussing it. This is, again, the most important aspect if you want here. You have no idea how many pictures, for example, I accumulated for making these videos. I don't even know how many they technically are, but you see some of the best pictures, including all, as you see here, historically valid. So yeah, I could have not accumulated this hadn't I properly addressed these topics that seem secondary, and that instead push me to, or anyone, just to look at this in particular through the video itself. So again, I consider this the measure of this channel's value in many ways, and I'm sure that we can profitably continue just like this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.